Hello. Emo Phillips, the American comedian, once said, when I was a kid, I used to pray every night for a new bicycle. Then I realized that the Lord doesn't work that way. So I just stole one and asked Him to forgive me. It's humorous but sad. Our world and many people in our world are run by people who believe like the kid does, namely in a God that does things. What caught my attention is the opinion of a Talmudic rabbi by the name Rav Yosef in the Talmud Berachot, page 60a, stating that one may pray up to the 40th gestational day to determine the sex of an embryo. Rav Yosef bases his opinion on his knowledge of other Judaic facts and laws and texts, and perhaps the teaching of his own ancestors and teachers. I've already mentioned the word Talmud, so I feel obligated to explain a bit about Judaic literature. There are 5 books attributed to Moses, written anywhere from 3,600 to 3,200 years ago. And according to the text of the Bible, these 5 books were written over the 40 years that the Jews were traveling in the Sinai desert under the supervision of Moses. In these 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, the Numbers, and Deuteronomy, there are a number of laws, and the Bible is meant to be a guide how to live. Yet, without a complementary set of laws to explain how to observe these laws, one would not know how to do them. For example, how to observe the Sabbath, or make a tefillin, the black boxes that are put on the arms and the head, or you name it, many other laws. This complementary set of laws and explanations were transmitted from father to son, from teachers to students for about 1400 years until the destruction of the second Jewish temple in Jerusalem. At that time, the Jewish nation had been through a major war, destruction, massacres, disease. And the rabbis had noted that, wow, Jews are being taken as slaves all over the world, especially to the Roman Empire. So they should write down these laws before they are forgotten. The rabbis who wrote the Mishnah, they themselves were just beginning to forget, and they had arguments occasionally as to what exactly Moses had taught. There is a law in the most medical book of Moses, namely Leviticus, stating that after birth, a woman who's delivered a son must abstain from having intercourse for 40 days, and a woman who's delivered a daughter must abstain from having sexual contact with her husband for 80 days. As you may know, there are tears in the birth canal, especially during the first childbirth. And even in the subsequent childbirths, there could be tears, or what we call subclinical tears, meaning tears that are not visible with naked eye, and these wounds need to heal. So abstaining from sexual activity for a few weeks would be perhaps a good idea for the health of the mother. In addition, prolactin hormone, the hormone that runs in the body of a nursing mother at a much higher level to induce the breasts to produce milk, alters the vaginal wall, its pH, and other characteristics, and makes the vaginal wall unsuitable for intercourse. During the entire period when a woman is nursing, she's even more predisposed to group A streptococcus infection based on certain reports. Now, why would Leviticus prohibit intercourse just for 40 to 80 days and base it based on the sex of the embryo and whether a female embryo would impact the mother differently than a male? I do not know. A question is brought up and answered in the Mishnah. What if a woman miscarried? The Mishnah answers that up to the 40th day, the mother does not need to consider herself pregnant. And in the subsequent text, it's even stated that what's discharged from her before the 40th day is as lifeless as water. Rav Ishmael, one of the rabbis who contributed in writing the Mishnah, states that from the 41st day on, a woman must abstain from having contact with her husband for 40 days as if she had a male embryo, because male embryos develop earlier than females, and after the 80th day she abstains from having sexual contact with her husband for 40 or 80 days, depending on whether she's discharged a male or a female embryo. The remainder of the rabbis who contributed in writing the Mishnah state that no, a male and a female embryo take the same amount of time, and after the 41st day, the woman must abstain either 40 or 80 days based on whether she's discharged a male or a female embryo. Let's look at what we read in an embryology textbook. This book, Before We Are Born, by Keith L. Moore and T.V.N. Persaud, is taught at medical schools. I was taught the older edition of this textbook at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, my medical school. So on day 1, either an X-containing sperm or a Y-containing sperm enters an egg. And from that moment on, the embryo is either an XX or an XY for the remainder of its life. This one cell containing 23 pairs of chromosomes divides into 2 cells containing each 23 pairs of chromosomes. And this division goes on and on. For the first week, this division is pretty uniform. At the end of the first week, there is vacuolation. Certain cells die off. In the second week, the embryo is essentially a disc of cells, initially 2-cell layered, and then it becomes a 3-cell layered disc. Up to the eighth embryonic day, the cells that make up an embryo do not communicate with each other. Every cell in our body communicates with other cells. For example, our skin cells all communicate via ion channels with each other. So in the first week of embryogenesis, the cells are so poorly differentiated that they don't even have those connecting ion channels. In the third week of embryogenesis, this plate of cells folds over itself And certain cells are destined to become the head, and certain cells are destined to become the extremities. In the fifth embryonic week, namely days 29 to 35, is when two colonies of cells develop in these primitive embryos destined to be gonadal cells. So at the end of the fifth week, the embryo is 5 to 8 millimeters. That's the actual size of the embryo, and it's smaller than my nail. So in this 35-day-old embryo, there are two colonies of cells in which certain genes are turned on and off, namely they are differentiated, and they produce molecules on the surface of the cells or within the cytoplasm inside the cells that we only see in gonadal cells. From there on, in an XX embryo, out of these two colonies of cells, in an XX embryo, the outer cells survive and the inner cells die off. And in an XY embryo, the inner cells survive and the outer cells die off. Human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, the hormone some of you may be familiar with, is the hormone that's a blood test is done and is looked for to see if a woman is pregnant or not, peaks around day 40. And around day 43, day 40 to day 43 is when this peak level of human chorionic gonadotropin hormone induces production of testes determining factor in an XY embryo. Testes determining factor induces these primitive gonadal cells to differentiate into testes earlier than ovaries. And in an XY embryo, because of lack of a similar chemical as testes determining factor, ovaries are developed later than testes are developed. One of the hottest medical fields nowadays is the science of epigenetics. Not every gene in our cells or the cells of an embryo is turned on in every given point of time. Certain genes are turned on and off in the initial embryo. Certain genes are turned off forever. Excuse me. The duration that the genes are left on and off are now known to be impacted by what a human is exposed to. For example, wars, famines, experiences we have in life, food we eat, medications we take, impacts the duration that genes are left on and off in our body. And sometimes this impact is transmitted through generations, up to like even 3 or 4 generations. The genitalia of an embryo is indeterminate, meaning the genitalia is identical between an XX and an XY embryo up to the 68th embryonic day. It's in this week, week 9, that the genitalia have the slightest difference. Before then, the genitalia are identical. And ovaries develop around day 77 to 84, and there is a definite difference between male and female genitalia in that week of 77 to 84. How humans back then, 2,000 years ago, contributing to the knowledge passed on to them from 3,000 years ago, new facts that matches with what we now see in embryology. And some of the facts in embryology textbooks are not even detected with microscopes. You sort of have to stain these cells with certain antibodies, magnify these antibodies with other chemicals so that they fluoresce, to be able to see that these chemicals are on the cell surface or inside the cytoplasm of the primitive gonadal cells. It may be a coincidence. Days 40 and 80 were common numbers. However, Rabbi Ishmael gets a major credit for saying that a male embryo develops earlier than a female embryo. 4 pages before the page in the Talmud where Rav Yosef states that one may pray up to the 40th day to determine the sex of an embryo, there is a Mishnah that states that if one is approaching his house and hears a sound, you're not allowed to say that, oh, I pray that nothing happened to my house. If something has happened, it has happened, and your prayers cannot change it. The next sentence states that it is an abomination to pray to determine or to change the sex of an embryo once a woman has conceived. Yet Rav Yosef, having strong faith in a God and in God that does things, states that yes, up to the 40th day, because he had the knowledge of this other Mishnah, that the sex is not determined, and because he believed that God does things, you could still ask God to change the sex of an embryo. In essence, Rav Yosef has turned the God of Israel, that's supposed to be the truth, into a mega sorcerer, a mega idol. Instead of having God of fertility, God of money, God of war, now we have one God, one mega idol that does it all. Can change the X chromosome and shrink it into a Y chromosome. His way of thinking makes a human who believes in this path a slave to the doctor or the scientist who truly knows the physical properties of matter and knows how to determine the sex of an embryo. Or the person who believes in a God who does things becomes a slave to a religious leader who knows how to tweak God, who knows which prayer to say to determine the sex of an embryo. In the first commandment, God introduces itself, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am your God, the one who took you out of Egypt, the land of slavery. It doesn't say, Anochi Hashem Elokecha Oseh Hakol, that I am your God who does it all. And in the second commandment, God states that we must abstain from worshipping idols, whether they are in the sky or in the oceans or wherever. And I define idols as fallacies. The moment one believes in a fallacy, whether it's visible or not, you're worshipping an idol, and you become a slave to the one who knows how to tweak this idol, or one who knows the truth. The point of my book is to explain to the world that one could read the Talmud and the Bible through the lens of solid scientific facts and differentiate between misunderstandings and true interpretation and meaning of messages of Moses. One does not need to learn astrophysics to figure out how the world was created, to assess the validity of the verses of Genesis. The Bible is a guide to live. My 7th grade Hebrew teacher said that it teaches us and guides us on the path of life. It is not a science book, it's not a history book. And people can read certain verses in the Bible and misinterpret it and make it look like it negates science. The verses of Genesis are interpreted by Dr. Rabbi Carl Feit, who has a PhD in microbiology and is an ordained Orthodox rabbi, or a physicist called Judah Landau. And they explain that in these days God perhaps set the laws of nature in these 6 metaphoric days, or that God started the world as a carpenter, and the verses are explained. To be honest, to me it's clear that the initial verses of the Genesis excuse me, is clearly talking about a flat earth. On the first day God created heaven and earth, so you have the earth and you have the heaven, and then on the 3rd day, just like light fixtures, God set the sun and the moon in the ceiling of heaven to rotate around us. Yes, Genesis is written for people 3,000 years ago to guide them how to live. Now, whether it's written by the physicians of the time or it's truly the message of God, I don't know. It's quite plausible that it was written by physicians of the time, yet there are certain details in there that are just freaky. The truth of the word is, and the emet of the word, and God is supposed to be emet meaning truth in Hebrew, that molecules never change. What's an X chromosome will remain always an X chromosome. If it's mutated, it will always be mutated, and they always are going to follow their physical properties within them. The molecules in gas chamber of Auschwitz behaved according to their nature, and they never deviated. In 1830, 220 Jews were beheaded in Tabriz, in northwestern current Iran, in one night, just because they were Jewish, and the blade never dulled. The belief in a God that does things is not the rational scientific message of the Bible, and it's brought us death, misery, and backwardness. In today's world, we tend to respect everyone else's opinions and say, look, as long as you don't hurt me, it's okay. The trouble the Hasidic Jews have is that reading the Bible through the lens of solid scientific facts renders them as utter idol worshippers. And in some ways it may even make the non-religious Jews living in Israel as ignorance and people who are just seek irresponsibility. The book Biopsies of the Bible connotes that it's about Bible and science, and yes, there is a lot of science and medicine included in it. In the conclusion of every major chapter, I relate the topic to today's political issues. For example, in the chapter about the parasitic infection of the pig, I state that infectious diseases do not differentiate between rich and poor, between citizen and non-citizen. And health care of others translates into health of each of us. There are 50 million people walking around the planet Earth today with holes in their brain settled by the larvae of pork tapeworm. 75% of these humans must not have eaten the infested pork, but they must have eaten the egg shed by another human who had eaten the infested pork, and now this human is harboring the adult worm shedding a lot of eggs. And I quote the entire article by a CDC doctor, Center for Disease Control doctor called James McGuire. I explain the natural history of pork, beef and fish tapeworm, and you decide for yourself how we could prevent neurocysticercosis, or at least diminish it. At the end of the chapters of evolution and Judaism and King Solomon, I discussed the whole political issues of Arab-Israeli conflict. And I quote articles out of Wall Street Journal reporting that in 2000 the CIA handed over the blueprint of a nuclear bomb to the Iranians, and now they are pursuing the ex-CIA agent who's revealed these secrets. Apparently this blueprint revealed to the Iranians, given to them for free, had a minor flaw that was easily discernible by a nuclear scientist. What kind of a Mossad agent would Jonathan Pollard be to reveal the secrets of US Navy, that the Syrians are having the chemical arsenal and missiles pointed at Israel? Ironically, for this whole Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I offer a solution, and this solution is brought by reading the Bible through the lens of solid scientific facts. Do I think I would be able to change the world, or you would be able to change the world with a 400-page book containing scientific knowledge? Let me tell you about my first-hand experience. It must have been 1975 when I was in the 3rd grade. One day I realized my dad believes the earth is flat. I told him, Daddy, look, the earth is round, it's like a ball rotating around itself and going around the sun, and that's why there is day and night, and there is a time difference between different countries. And he looked at me and said, what do you mean? He could see that the earth is flat, and that's the way it's always been. And yes, he could see the earth is flat. This is what he was witnessing, and this is what he was taught by others. And I bet he must have seen the picture of the moon and the earth on the front page of the paper in 1967, had heard of it on the radio. In the Persian language, the earth is called the sphere of the earth. Yet, he still believed that the earth is flat because this is what he could see. It will take years of education, years of sincere, educated education to people for them to change and hopefully follow the path of the truth and solid scientific facts, and have a religion that interlaces with solid scientific facts. That's when we'll have peace and health. I'm looking forward to your feedback on the subjects discussed in Biopsies of the Bible. Thank you for your time.